surprise guest just popped into the studio today, and it was Maura Sweeney. And Maura works for the Huffington Post. You might have seen it if you're on the internet. There are various blogs on there. There's some excellent writing on there. Some brilliant journalism on the Huffington Post. And we just got talking, myself and Maura, about the USA, the relationship between the States and Britain. And so let's start, Maura, by talking about... Well, journalism, first of all, I think is a good place to start. You're a journalist, you're a writer. We have very different attitudes, don't we, the British, towards our media. For example, tabloids. The British tabloids are seen as gossipy, prying, revelatory, nefarious. You know, people don't like what they do. In America, what's it like? What's the difference?
We have our own brand of tabloids, but I will have to say, unlike the Brits, when you have a tabloid in America and you are the average American, you generally like to keep it a secret. I'm not saying nobody likes them. You can go to any grocery store and you will see them all over. There's the Store, there's the National Enquirer. But the funny thing is, I'll give you a perfect example. I will be bringing my groceries across the bridge or the cashier area, and I'm always finding my eyeballs going to whatever happened. Oftentimes we do have information about the royals, but I'll never buy one of those papers because only trashy people buy papers like that. We're here in England, I think everyone just has them, shares them, reads them routinely.
Well, they sell far more, the tabloids, than the so-called quality newspapers or the broadsheets, as they're known. And we are fascinated as a culture, I think, and as a nation by kiss and tells, who's, staying at whose hotel at night. Is that not something that the Americans are interested in?
No, Americans are very much interested. You're talking about like the prurient interest.
Yeah.
The funny thing that I always think about with the Brits is that you all appear to me to be quite polite. So it's almost like the things you wouldn't talk about in polite culture, you'll read about every single day in your tabloids.
Yeah.
In America, we tend to be far more open, I guess, in our conversation and our news so that we don't always need to read those kinds of papers. I usually think that the Brits are a little more highbrow than the Americans. So I think that there must be some difference within your culture where you come off as more highbrow, but you're avid readers of the kiss and tell stories, where with us, it's part of our culture, and so we don't always need to buy the papers.
I mean, at the moment, I say that's a really interesting analysis, and at the moment we've got this big inquiry going on, or we did have the Leveson inquiry into how our media operates, and the prying into celebrities' lives, the stories. I mean, there is this notion of public interest versus what the public are interested in, if you see that distinction.
What the public's interested in is generally what sells.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And what I've realized even in the States, and I think this bothers a lot of serious journalists, is that they can spend their time and they could do an excellent story. It has a lot of thought put behind it. But because it doesn't appeal necessarily to the prurient interest,
that's right.
Like you would say the kiss and tell, the stories about who's been where and what are they doing.
It wouldn't sell.
And it doesn't. And this has happened routinely. But that's where you get the financial end versus the good journalism end. And I think sometimes you could probably tell a great journalistic story. You could get all the details in, but they don't necessarily have to bring people down into the mud. And that to me would be a good merging of the two.
Excellent. I mean, you touched on the royals just a few moments ago. We must talk about the American obsession, that the fairy tale postcard view you have, castles and princesses of our royals. And you are fascinated by our royal family, aren't you?
Yes, I would say the Americans are. But I'd also say there's been an ebb and a flow. Probably years ago when we had just the Queen of England, I don't know how many Americans were really interested. Once Princess Diana came around, everyone was in love with the royals in America. She fell, she passed away, and there was really a vacancy. Now we see with the newest royals, that's a big thing again in America. There must be this idea of being able to relate to youth, to chicness, to style, and I think that's where I would tell you, Camilla, yes, we see her in the tabloids, but I don't think that there's any kind of a love affair with Camilla, or even with Prince Charles. But you get the next generation that comes in, and there's something that definitely appeals to the American sentiment.
Is that a glamour problem, do you think? Is that because Charles and Camilla aren't glamorous?
Yes, and I would also say the Queen of England, we would not consider to be glamorous. That's more like the old style. Pardon my expression here. There's a little bit of the frumpiness. I guess we all get there eventually.
Sure.
But yes, definitely when you get the style mavens, what's chic, Americans love that.
I've always wondered about the American fascination with it, because it's such a democratic nation, the United States. And I mean that in the sense of, obviously the way your constitution is built up, but also when you look at your elections, for example, things like the primaries, you are meticulous about democracy. It's complicated and it's to the nth degree. So why are you so interested in an institution whereby by right of birth you get to rule?
You're curious about it, so am I, because I look at it and I think, what is it about the Brits that they need the royals? It's in your culture. We were almost the anti-royals. If you think about when America broke off during the Revolutionary War, we were anti-royal. But I think there's something in all of us that we desire to esteem something higher or better than ourselves, and that's probably the similarity.
And maybe it's just a curious fascination with something that you don't have as a nation. I think if there's something that another nation has, perhaps you look at it as a curio almost.
Maybe, but you're right. Our nation is very democratic, and it's almost hard for me to imagine. It's probably not the same today as it was years ago, but you really had a firm class structure here.
Yeah, I would say so.
Do you still feel it these days?
I think the lines are becoming more and more blurred, but yeah, I think class still divides people here. It still plays in our life. Does that not happen in the States with the class systems?
No. That's it. Well, look at our last couple of presidents. Look at President Clinton. He didn't have a dad. His mom, I had a little bit of a questionable background, and he ended up at Georgetown University. I think he went to Yale after that, and he ends up in the White House, the top spot. And then you could even look at like the Obamas. Yeah. Now these would be the black part of our culture that when I was a very little girl, they would be part of the have-nots, which was so unfortunate. Today they're in the White House. So from that perspective, I would say yes, we definitely have the kind of country where everyone can be equaled.
And that's the American dream, isn't it? I don't know if that's a cliche to you now, but the idea that you can, with the correct amount of work and effort and luck, you can make it, you can get to where you want to be. Is that still something Americans hold to?
Yes, I will say lately with what's been going on with our economy, there's more of a distance between the haves and the have-nots. We're sort of losing out on that middle class culture. But I would definitely say that over and over again, you can come to the United States and with a generation or two, really move up. We don't have, again, because of that class consciousness, it doesn't exist. I know that in the past, we had a little bit of it, but today, generally, if you can work hard enough in America, you can get to wherever it is you're looking to go.
It must bring with it some disillusionment. I think if you're a car worker in Detroit, say, you start to realize the American dream might just be illusory, a bit of a sham in many ways. And I wonder, for example, your attitude again to welfare and politics. What's left wing in the UK, for example, would be seen as almost communist in America. For example, let's talk about our welfare state. We have a benefit system that if you're out of work, looks after you. Basically, it's not the riches of a king, but it's a livable existence. And in America, you don't have a welfare state like that.
You're right, we don't. And I contemplate these an awful lot because in America, we were sort of the progressive nation. We were always ahead of everyone. But in many ways, we're quite resistant. When you compare us with whatever's going on here in Europe, someone mentioned this. It was friends of ours from England. They said when they moved over to the United States, they felt like there was no security blanket. If you were to fall, you would land on the street in America. And I know we do have certain programs where we do take care of those who really don't support themselves. But you're right. Things over here might be, on your far left, would be considered communist in America. Yeah. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. Like we look at healthcare, we finally moved into Obamacare. It's yet to be seen how it's going to work out, but that's something considered here in Europe to be just status quo, where there's a huge resistance to it in our country.
I know. It's seen as almost communist, isn't it?
Yes.
The idea of the state looking after its citizens.
There's a deeper reason behind that, as I've learned from a lot of my inquiries. People in America who are on the right believe that if too much is given, human nature might cause people not to work hard, not to strive, not to be as creative, as innovative, as entrepreneurial as they could be. They think it might actually weaken the fiber of our nation. And that's the reason why those on the right stay there.
What about Obama then? As indeed his second term draws to a close, what do you think the legacy will be?
You know, I've asked a number of people, what do they think the legacy will be? And I think it remains to be seen. First and foremost, he was going to be written as the man of color who made it into the White House first. I'm sure we'll have those in the future. That was enormous. I would say that'll be his main legacy. Beyond that, I think there's something of a mixed bag, and I think his personality is such that, you know, unlike a President Clinton who'd come in, he'd talk to anybody, there's something about President Obama where he's a little bit, I would almost say British. He's a little bit reserved, and I don't think that people could so much relate to him. So we'll see how the future of Obamacare comes out. But I would say first and foremost, his legacy will be he was the first man of color to make it into the White House, which really for our nation is a huge, huge move forward.
So even though President Obama made it, to office, the first black president, a landmark moment, as you say, but what about race in America? How latent is racism still in America, do you think?
When I first moved to Florida, which was quite a few years ago, it was there. My husband remembered it down south. It was very much there. In fact, it made him sad because he used to travel throughout the southern states in business. And he said there were black people that wouldn't even look him in the eye. And we're coming from the northern areas, and we did not know that degree of racism. Today, if it is there, as I'm sure it is, and sometimes it's there with blacks against whites. There are future generations that felt like, what did you do to my ancestors? And I think that you'll find that in any society, but not nearly the way it was years ago.
Do you think it's there but not as vocalized? I noticed the scandal with the LA baseball guy very recently, that secret tape where you think, okay, we've not moved on, actually. We thought we had, but then this tape emerges.
I think that about the human race. We haven't moved on, but we thought we did. That was horrific. And I know that that's an event that will continue. My husband's also a journalist, and that's one of the things he'd like to tackle, but thinks it's a little complex at this point. But I would say there are always going to be people that have various types of resistance to other cultures. But by and large, you're talking to me. I'm really colorblind. By the way, when I leave here, I'm going to forget what you look like, but I'll remember everything we talked about. I was like that since I was a child. So sometimes I almost have to ask other people to see what they think. But I will share this with you. I remember a number of years ago working in the telecom industry, and I was a manager. I was ready to promote one woman into a position, and I was told by my director that it wasn't a good idea because she was a woman of color and we would probably lose clients. I was so offended by that because in my own mind, this is a woman that deserved her promotion. So I guess there's always latent feelings, but by and large, we have moved a great deal from where we were, let's say, even in the 60s and the 70s.
We're talking about some of the differences between the States and Britain, but nonetheless, there is this special relationship. It's often mooted, it goes back to our military history, the World Wars, but culturally as well. You're here in Liverpool, Maura, the Beatles, and all that.
That's why I'm here.
Oh, right, great. I mean, it's very recently, we marked 50 years since the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Right. Can I date myself here? I'm 56, and I could actually remember I was a little girl, 5.5 years old, let's say, and my aunt came over to the house and she said to us, "We've got to watch the Beatles. They're on Ed Sullivan tonight." And here I am, this little girl. I said, the Beatles, all I kept thinking about were beetle insects on the ground. What would they be doing on the Ed Sullivan Show? We watched them. They were shaking their head. But I have to tell you, it was such a defining moment that here I am in Liverpool 50 years later looking for the Beatles and what kind of a legacy they left behind. It was a huge, huge date in America, and the girls were going crazy. People, by the way, in America didn't know what to do with them when they first arrived.
Really?
They were all these screaming girls, but I remember the mop tops. Is that what they called them?
Yes. Yeah,
they were shaking their heads. Nobody had ever seen them. They didn't know the music, but they caught on so quickly. But they were phenomena.
I think sometimes we forget being in Liverpool. Sometimes when you're in the area, the very city that gave this to everybody else, you forget the significance of it. And we need to be reminded of it. And for you to come and say that, as someone you've come over from the States to see the Beatles stuff, it just reminds me of how important it was and what a cultural seismic moment it was.
I will tell you, back then, we would think of London, we would think of Liverpool as being the place that was really the hip place to be. So even though we were young Americans, let's say, the culture was coming to us from Great Britain, and it was very cool. I mean, I remember when Twiggy first came out. So you had that whole London scene. It was such a great vibe, and it's still with us in the American culture.
There are cities that you could quote. If I came to the States and you were to ask me where I was from, I think only two cities would have huge resonance. One would be London, of course, but Liverpool would be the other. Am I right to say that?
Yes, absolutely. We wouldn't think Bristol or Manchester. No, it would be Liverpool.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize just how much history you have here in Liverpool beyond the Beatles and beyond that whole British invasion.
It's partly to do with the way we face you, isn't it? We're looking out to you across the Atlantic.
Yeah, I guess.
There's something in that, I think. Just the fact of our geography. I think we've got that special relationship as a city with the States.
Definitely. And I will tell you, this is my second trip here to England. I love London. I had this strange sensation, though, being here that we are... even though we're a much larger country, that we're like the junior to England. You've got very deep, steeped cultures and institutions where everything we have is a lot newer. And it's almost like you go way deep into the ground where we're almost like at ground level. I think of us as almost being like a younger relative to England.
Yeah, sure, okay. I mean, we've talked a lot about the cultural differences and similarities. What about let's talk about some of the writing that you do, Maura, for the Huffington Post, because you're very into people's mindsets and the notion that you can do anything at any time. Again, it's quite an American thing, I think.
It is, but it is and it's not. I write right now specifically for an audience that has probably lost its footing. And although I don't consider myself even necessarily just writing for females or writing for people that are 50 and older, there are people in America that have gotten very comfortable with where they were. We had a mindset of what America was like, how we operated, what our economy was like, and we've had a digital revolution. Everything has changed. Even the economies have changed. We've had a lot of corporate cultures that have left. We've had jobs that have gone away. We've had so many changes. And I think there's this group of people, they don't even need to be 50. They could be 40. And they could suddenly think, what happened? How come the tiles on my floor went away? And so I write for people so that they can think about new possibilities rather than waiting for something outside of themselves to present themselves for a job, for a new way of seeing life, a new form of life, let's say a new lifestyle when you're 50 and older or when you're middle age. I write and I interview a lot of people. I've traveled to over 40 countries, and I love to be able to bring new thoughts to people's minds, share other stories so that they can go into their own hearts and say, you know what? I always wanted to do this when I was a child. I wonder if I could find a new way to do it today.
Yeah.
I love being able to do that.
I think it's important not to frame that in the reference or to coin that as new age psychobabble, is it? Because I think it's easy to dismiss what you're talking about as sort of, airy-fairy new age stuff, but it's not. It's all about having a positive mindset and believe it. I mean, a lot of our listeners are in the 40s and 50s, 60s. I think this will resonate with them, Maura, the idea that they can change their lives still at that time.
Well, you know what? It's probably worth mentioning right now. I was groomed to be a New Jersey lawyer, and I was halfway through law school in New Jersey, and I just thought, this is so not me. I'm not happy. I don't want to have a career in this state. I really want to move someplace warmer. And I ended up for quite a few years in business. I started my own business with my husband. I have been a homeschooling mom with our daughter, who now lives in London, works for World Photography. And these days, I am actually a late in life journalist. My husband is an entrepreneur. I work with him full time, and we actually created something called The Mic, TheeMike. He's an animated microphone who reports on sports. Right. This was my husband's idea. I was in the computer industry. He said, I'm getting bored. The industry's getting old. I want to do something that has purpose. So we took an idea, created a trademark property, and this little Mike the Microphone has 34 sports comic books out.
Yeah, wow.
We love it, and we found a way to monetize it. So I not only write about new possibilities, I'm very grounded and very experienced, and I'm living them out.
It's better to say you did than you didn't, isn't it? It's better to at least try something, and give it a go.
Hey, I could give you a little plug for being here in England. At least you do have a safety net that people could fall into. In America, people don't, and they cling on to things thinking that if they don't have what they've got in front of them, they'll lose everything.
But that's fair enough, isn't it? That's quite a reasonable...
It is.
Yeah. You can't blame people for thinking that.
No, you can't.
I mean, did you have, when you established these other ventures and you changed your life in your 40s or whatever, did you have financial backup?
You know what? I would say we're a little bit different from not the ordinary, but the typical American. When everybody else was buying bigger houses and they were just getting themselves more into debt, my husband and I were just the opposite. And we've probably been planning this for our entire lives to be able to do something fun. But we live very simply, and we choose to spend our money on the things that we like. And we also live in Florida, which is a less expensive state.
Yeah. But you could apply what you're saying to many things, I think, and many aspects of life. I mean, relationships, it could be you might be in a relationship you don't want to be in, or a marriage you don't like to be.
I write about those things too.
And I think it's important to say, isn't it, that the cage, my mindset is that the cage is never locked. I think some people sometimes put themselves in a cage and think that this is it. This is my lot. I can't move on. I'm trapped in the situation.
Simon,
and the cage is always open, I always think.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. See, I was in that cage as a young woman, being told from the time I was a little girl, you're going to be a lawyer. Do you call them lawyers here, or barristers?
Yeah.
Okay. It just didn't fit me. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about, number one, I had to find my own happiness in life, but I like to encourage others to do the same. And people have such unbelievable talents, but oftentimes because they're so busy responding maybe to what they were told they were supposed to be, or even their socioeconomics told them this is what you're going to be. And I always love to show them that there are so many other things they can do. And much of our outside experience really comes from what our thoughts are within our own minds.
That's true. I mean, also that plugs again into the class system in some ways. Because when I was growing up, for example, Maura, I was never told about, say, Oxford or Cambridge, these, our elite universities. It wasn't the path, that I was supposed to tread along. And I look back and think, well, why not? Why couldn't I have got there? Why wasn't I encouraged? My teachers never mentioned it. Maybe I wasn't bright enough, I don't know. But, I'm sure I could have given it a go.
Judging from what I'm sitting across from, I'd say you're exceptionally bright. But see, I totally agree with you on that. I was just I'll add this one little funny thing. I've just mentioned to you, I've traveled to over 40 countries. I grew up in a home that wanted to see Maura Sweeney as the next New Jersey lawyer, but at the same time, I wasn't allowed out beyond my front stoop. Right. And so I had many restrictions in my own life. They didn't have to be class restrictions, but I believe so many of us will be stunted because we think we can't. And I'd rather just encourage people that they can. And I live it out. I brought up a daughter who, believe it or not, wanted to work in London. She's in London.
She's done it.
And by the way, should I tell you this? She's also at Harvard as a graduate student.
Wonderful.
And so it's possible for anyone at any time.
Yes, we can, as Obama himself said.
Yes.
Let's leave it there. Maura, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks a lot for coming in.
Thank you for having me.